Time now for Back Pages tonight here on Sky Sports News, bringing you a first look at the sports stories in the morning's newspapers. And joining us are Miguel Delaney from The Independent and Ian Ladyman from the Daily Mail. Welcome to you both. Let's quickly run through the back pages. Arteta leading in a lot of them. Arteta's window pane is the Express headline. Boss laments deadline day letdown, but backs Havertz. Telltale signs looking up for Spurs. That's the tell. Prem holds line on Club World Cup and full-on role for Marcus Smith. The rugby features in The Guardian. Also headlining Arsenal misfire. Arteta disappointed by lack of forwards in transfer window. And Tell's story, unbelievable finisher eyeing a starting role with Spurs. The Eye has statement of intent, the pros and cons of tearing down St James's Park. Premier League insists referees are getting better, while United's window shows they've given up on season, and Raducanu does not need a new coach, she needs two. As for the Daily Mail, we've failed, is the headline. Arteta misery after Arsenal blow chance to sign a striker. Ian's paper, of course. Borthwick gambles on the Smiths. Genus returns after sexting scandal shakes a talk sport, a media story there. And in the Sun, there's a time and a place. So be an angel of the North Miles. Good twist on the Carabao Cup second leg semi-final there. Arteta warns stars not to rile up Toon fans. Eddie steady go is the Newcastle perspective. Let's start with Mikel Arteta's comments then on Arsenal's transfer activity. This headline in The Guardian, Ian. Arsenal misfire. Arteta disappointed by lack of forwards in transfer window. Ed Aarons with the piece. He was still quite collaborative in his comments, Ian, but what were your thoughts on how candid he was about his emotion, I suppose, about not getting more recruits?
Yeah, it's a fair point that you make there. I think he's been quite careful not to come across as being critical of the people who employ him. But equally, there has been a marked departure in terms of Arteta and what he has said about players and the transfer window. Mikel Arteta never gets involved with things like this. He always straight backs questions about incoming transfers, outgoing transfers, contracts, etc. He really is quite pleasantly dull a lot of the time, Arteta, and that's not a criticism. It's just the way that he deals with us on the whole. But there's been a real change of stance. Last week, Arteta said, we lack goals, we lack people, we lack options. He made it absolutely clear last week that he wanted a goal scorer before the end of the window. He went in with that very late bid for Ollie Watkins, of course, which seemed a little bit superficial. I don't really see how they ever thought that was really going to work, especially given that Villa were in the process of selling John Duran and another forward. But Arteta has made his point here, made his point clear, made it to his board, he's made it to the supporters. He feels they are a striker light. Of course, the rest of us have been talking about that for a long, long time. It's interesting that these comments come 2 days after they've scored 5 against Manchester City. But Arteta wants a striker. They haven't got one. And we'll find out in May whether that will be a conclusive or a pivotal part of this window, or just something else that kind of ends up being lost in the wind over time.
Yeah, hindsight will be 2020 in the summer, won't it? The Metro, of course, cover it as well. And their front of the back page, their window pane disappoints, but Arteta keeps faith. James Goldman with the piece here. Miguel, a quote here from Arteta. We had a clear intention, which is always when a window opens, to explore the opportunities to improve our squad. With players with injuries, we've been impacted and we haven't achieved it. What do you think that the problem is? Is it a lack of quality forwards out there? Is it a lack of money at Arsenal, or a lack of direction indicated, as Ian says, maybe by the Watkins sort of flurry?
I mean, I think the Watkins bid showed what they were considering or how much they were willing to move. I do think there was an element of opportunism about it because of the knowledge that Villa needed to sell. Because on the whole, Arsenal, as we've seen, they've been restrained. And I don't think it's a lack of direction. I think it's actually the opposite. That, like you mentioned, potential of hindsight in May. But really, I think this has primarily come down to Arsenal looking to the summer. And it's why I think, I'm sure we'll get to this, the story of this transfer window in general has been clubs not spending rather than spending, because it is so much more difficult to do business in January. And that in a world where recruitment is now so specified, like a lot of clubs would say, so advanced. We know the names of so many sporting directors now. Arsenal would see themselves along those lines naturally. In the summer, they want a forward as they wanted last year, but I think they feel they can get a better option. They also want, they will almost certainly get Martin Zubimendi and a wide forward as well. And from what I've been told, which is what I've written for today as well, I mean, obviously, like, Arteta's willing to say a certain amount, but I think he stopped short as well because a lot of the say comes down to him. The club's recruitment will be guided by his preferences, and he is known to be very particular, especially about his forward options. And I think that's really what it came down to. He didn't just want a body in. He wanted someone that would actually, A, enhance what he's got, and B, is in keeping. I think this is the crucial point, in keeping with what they want for the summer. So say, like, for example, with Benjamin Sesko, who is one of their top forward targets, for Leipzig, he's potentially worth an extra 50 million now because they want to get back into the Champions League. Well, there's all sorts of talk that he has a deal with them that if he goes at the end of the summer, they let him go for a lower price. So in that situation, had Arsenal done it now rather than the summer, it may have affected other business that they want to bring in. I think it's obviously, there's a risk to it, at least in terms of this season's challenges, but it's a calculated risk, and I suppose that comes across, and as Ian's alluded to, Arteta's very calculated way of speaking as well.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? It was balanced, but he is disappointed. Obviously, in the last 16 in the Champions League themselves, Arsenal, and still in the Premier League title race after their epic win over Manchester City. A player linked with him is Matisse Tell. Let's talk about Tell with the back page of the Express, Ian. Alan Smith reporting there for them. Telltale signs looking up for Spurs. Matisse Tell believes his Tottenham loan was, quote-unquote, the best option after sealing a deadline day switch from Bayern Munich. Is this a bit of a coup, in particular for Spurs and Ange Postecoglou after the player was linked with Arsenal and Manchester United, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, players always turn up and tell the club that they're joining that they always wanted to go there and they were their first choice. Sometimes the truth is actually a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated. I'm yet to hear a footballer turn up at a football club and say, "Oh, didn't really want to come, but I had no other options." But Spurs will be delighted. They wanted him. He very much fits the profile of player that their sporting director, Johan Lange, has, and that Daniel Levy has for the future. They want to buy young players. They want to buy players that will develop and will get better and will increase in value. And this is a transfer that fits that bill. I actually think Ange Postecoglou will be in the short term more delighted that he got a centre half in. They've lost Dragusin now as well. I know that Van de Ven is about to come back, and we expect him to play against Liverpool on Thursday night in the Carabao Cup. But it's been across the back where Tottenham have been absolutely desperately struggling through injuries, etc., in recent weeks, and I'm sure they'll be delighted to have Kevin Danso in, and I think I would imagine he will play Thursday as well, and that will give them some of that security that Tottenham really, really need.
I wonder if it was enough, Miguel. Let's go to the back page of the Star, where Tell's a real top teen, says Harry Kane. A ringing endorsement from Kane, saying he's a great guy, really hard-working and full of potential. Sky Germany colleagues telling us that he wants to play up front, so we'll see if that works out at Tottenham. But is there been neglect by Daniel Levy and company not to bring in more defenders, Miguel? What's your assessment of it? Not just because of the injuries currently, but the likelihood from what we've seen that the injury is going to keep coming with the high line.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's been a recurring issue all season. I think when you speak to people around the kind of the general transfer industry, there was maybe surprise given Spurs' obvious need that they acted so late. And this is obviously in the context of a lot more debate and a lot more criticism of how Daniel Levy has run the football side of the club. It has to be said, I suppose, the business at the end did seem a little bit haphazard, even if they've ultimately got most of what they wanted. By the same token, Tell, who was widely reported, he didn't initially want to go to Spurs. He is still a coup of a signing because he's a young forward. That when the news broke that he wanted to leave Bayern Munich, I mean, pretty much all of the major clubs in Europe were alerted by this because he was one of those players that whose profile fit a lot of what I wanted. He's got a really high ceiling, really high potential for development. I think, say, with Arsenal, just to return to the team in that sense, and this kind of, I suppose, speaks to what we're saying about Arteta. He didn't want him right now, A, because of the difficulty of doing a deal with Bayern, and B, because there was some doubt of whether he could make quite the impact right now. Spurs have different needs, and I think he will. He's a really good signing for them, even if it's come from a bit of a roundabout process.
Yeah, going to be exciting to watch, isn't it? It's always exciting to watch Tottenham, to be fair, under Ange Postecoglou. Back page of the eye. Let's talk refereeing. Ian, Mikel Arteta pretty unhappy recently with Miles Lewis-Skelly sending off, but the Premier League insists referees are getting better, writes Oliver Young-Miles. It's been Tony Scholes, the Premier League's chief football officer, is reporting the latest stats. Does it feel that way, Ian, or when it's VAR, do we always want 100%? There's less forgiveness, whatever's the stats say.
It's a really, really interesting subject. I've been sitting here thinking about this before the programme started, and the problem is that the perception is that the standard of refereeing in this country isn't very good. I'm a generally supporter of referees. I think they have a very difficult job, not helped by the way that players behave, not helped by the way that managers and coaches behave, and the way that players are told to behave. However, referees are undermined in a way by VAR, because VAR's proved itself to be imperfect, and we can talk about VAR all day. People thought that VAR was going to solve all the game's problems in terms of decisions and accuracy, and of course it hasn't, because human beings are still involved. In terms of the referees and decisions that they make, I actually think, Miguel and I travel around Europe, travel around the world watching football. Our referees are certainly no worse than anybody else's, and they're damn sight better than a lot of other countries. You only have to see the officiating at World Cups and European Championships to know that. But it's a high-profile nature of some mistakes that really do hold them back. We had one only 10 days ago at Molineux, the Miles Lewis-Skelly, Michael Oliver one. There was another one last night. I was at Stamford Bridge. The Chelsea equaliser shouldn't have stood. It's when they get the big things wrong that holds the whole process of credibility back. And I think at the moment there are still too many of those very, very obvious and glaring mistakes being made.
And also a lot of protracted decisions as well, Miguel. Let's talk about something I suppose we referred to a moment ago, was fatigue and player injury. But you've been writing a piece about the FIFA Club World Cup's effect on the Premier League schedule. And Tony Scholes has said it's not going to affect it much at all, is he?
Well, not that it won't affect much. He basically said it was put to him that if Manchester City or Chelsea get to the final, which is the 13th of July, and that, of course, after the competition starts 2 weeks after the Champions League final, the final is just 33 days before the start of the Premier League. And that is obviously an issue, given the players now have, contractually, they have a minimum of 3 weeks break. This is obviously a problem for both if they get to the final. But the Premier League have had to essentially decide that no, they can't delay their fixtures because the calendar, the exact words were, the calendar is already too squeezed as it is, and this largely because of a competition that the Premier League didn't want. The FIFA have almost unilaterally, well, not almost, FIFA have unilaterally imposed this in the game. And I know we've spoken on the show actually about how the Champions League, the expanded Champions League, has caused major issues in the calendar. So it's a difference that the Premier League and other bodies would see there was that they were involved in the process to form this. Like they were consulted as stakeholders, whereas the frustration with the Club World Cup it's just been imposed upon them. And so there's just as they said, there's two elements to it. One is the fact that their competition shouldn't be affected by it, and B, that they just can't allow the space anymore. The calendar is too squeezed. It is, and I suppose this is maybe where we start to see more give in terms of just how stretched and packed this calendar is. We're already seeing injuries that I think it's had a real influence in the Premier League table this season, as well as how more there was more unpredictability to the Champions League group stage. But this has to give at some point. And FIFA have lines in this saying that, we're only responsible for 1% of the calendar, whereas all the other bodies are responsible for 99% of the calendar. But FIFA is the ultimate overseer of the game. They're supposed to almost be the independent regulator in this, solving issues like fixture congestion. Instead, they've kind of become a competitor almost by putting in this competition. And there's all sorts of bigger discussions we can have there about why it exists and why it exists in this form, even if the actual idea is some way noble.
Yep, ultimately the human body can only do so much, can't it? However fit these top athletes are. Miguel and Ian, I'm sure that's a story we'll come back to in the coming months a few times, particularly in the summer. We'll take a quick break now, though. When we come back, we'll look at more of the back pages, including this set in the sun. A very unique preview of Arsenal's trip to Newcastle on Wednesday night. Welcome back. You are watching Backpages tonight, and welcome back to Miguel Delaney from The Independent and Ian Ladyman from the Daily Mail. Let's go to the Sun Sport, looking ahead to Newcastle versus Arsenal. And Ian, I know it's competitive, but hats off to the Sun for this. Backpage, there's a time and a place with Miles Lewis-Skelly done up as the Angel of the North. So being Angel of the North, Miles, Arteta warns stars not to rile up Toon fans. That's a pretty good back page. It's a pretty big game coming up, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm delighted to see that back pages like that are not yet a lost art. Brilliant headline, that is. 10 out of 10. But absolutely, in terms of the game and the subject matter there, obviously this is a knock-on effect from the game at the Emirates on Sunday when Arsenal hammered Manchester City. And there was kind of goal celebrations, Lewis Skelly mimicking Erling Haaland, etc. A lot of emotion in that game. And this is, I wrote a piece about this today, actually, appeared in today's paper. It's one of the characteristics of this Arsenal team. They are an emotional team. And when I mean an emotional team, football's a game of emotions, of course, but when you're on the field, we expect a lot of our top players to keep a lid on it. Arsenal tend to go the other way. They kind of feed off that emotion. It drives them, and you can see on occasions like Sunday it absolutely works for them. However, I've been at the Emirates and other stadiums when it hasn't worked for them. Arteta's an emotional coach. I think that transmits a little bit as well, and obviously he's probably seen a little bit in what happened on Sunday, Arteta, and thought, well, they're going to Newcastle. We know what St James's Park can be like. Newcastle haven't won a trophy for many, many, many years. The 2-0 ahead after the first leg, it will be absolutely jumping. And the one thing that he can't have his players doing is getting involved in an emotional fist fight, if you know what I mean. An emotional fist fight, because that will only work against him. What he needs is Arsenal to impose quality. He needs him to impose quality on that football game against a team that's talented but have lost their last 2 games at home. So that is what Mikel Arteta needs, and I think maybe just a little bit of messaging to his players there. I'm sure that people like Declan Rice are saying it as well. A little bit of messaging to his players to play the game with their feet and not so much with their hearts on this occasion.
Interesting, isn't it? Lifting a little bit on the lid on the nuance involved in different teams, different opponents as well. Arteta said, Miguel, we talk about those things and have to understand that each ground is different. Understandably, I suppose it's a nod of respect, isn't it, to St James's Park, who are going to be absolutely desperate to get back to another final and maybe get a trophy for the first time, domestic one in 70 years.
Yeah, I mean, look, it won't take any incident like a celebration or anything similar to make this ground loud tomorrow. I think this is going to be one of the atmospheres of the season because of that anticipation. But I suppose what Arteta said as well has a kind of a different edge as well, just because this is actually a meeting between 2 teams that have developed, I think, a bit of a real on-pitch rivalry over the past few years. I mean, as good as Arsenal have become over that time, one of the teams that have had their number more than most is actually Newcastle. They've kept 4 clean sheets in the last 6. Obviously, there was a 2-0 defeat. There's been some other significant victories over that time, including actually when they stopped Arsenal getting to the Champions League in 2022. And I think Newcastle will be emboldened by that. As Ian says, though, there is kind of the drop-off, just a sudden or even abrupt drop-off in form. And it's where I do wonder whether the timing of this League Cup, and again, I suppose this comes back to how packed the calendar is as well, but the timing of the fixtures could actually be an unusually significant factor in this game. Because, I mean, like, it's a month between the games. Newcastle's form it's quite different. I mean, they've gone from a 9-game winning streak in all competitions to 2 defeats and 3 both at home. They're missing a player, as Howe spoken about, Lloyd Kelly, against his wishes, really, due to PSR having to go on loan to Juventus. And Arsenal have suddenly found that goal-scoring form. And I suppose if Arsenal, say, get the first goal in this match, it will maybe change the entire tone of the game. But I think what's going to characterise this is Newcastle going to come out, I suppose, with a real ferocity. Because, I mean, that's another element about this rivalry as well. I think there's been a few on-pitch incidents that have really kind of fired it. And like, say, last season when Newcastle had that goal that Arsenal thought should have been disallowed, Newcastle players remember the complaints about that. There's a bit of fire in this, and it just adds something to what is actually a really, really good cup tie.
You imagine they'll forget the fatigue, won't they, early on in the game, Newcastle, with that crowd behind them. On that note, Ian, your take on this in the Eye, the statement of intent They've got a special report on the pros and cons of tearing down St James's Park. How do you assess that conundrum for Newcastle? Because their home is such a wonderful place for them and such a sometimes fearful place for others.
Well, I tell you what, I think one of the most significant stories that I've heard you talk about in the last hour or so on the programme has been that one that Miguel just touched on, the fact that Newcastle have been forced to let a player like Lloyd Kelly go, albeit on loan, to get themselves the right side of the Premier League's financial guidelines. And this is what something like the debate around the stadium is tied up in. Because of the spending restrictions that we have in this country now, if Newcastle, despite the wealth of their owners, Newcastle ever want to move to the level that they want to be at and stay there, I mean, a regular Champions League club, a club that can win the Premier League, they have to make more money on a match day from their stadium. Tottenham, by building a new stadium, went from £1 million every match day to £6 million every match day. That's what has to happen at Newcastle, whether it's a rebuild of St James's Park or a new stadium. It has to happen. It'll upset people. It'll upset Newcastle fans. I understand that, but something has to give. Something has to give. The only thing I'll say about this is, if they do build on that site, and I was reading a bit of that story earlier, if they do build on that site and they overlap the way that Tottenham Stadium overlapped on part of the old White Hart Lane, where are Newcastle going to play while that is taking place? I'd be very interested to know. There's no Wembley available to Newcastle like there was for Tottenham. Will Newcastle play while that's taking place? I don't think they're going to go and play at Sunderland, are they?
It's a curious one, isn't it? Middlesbrough maybe a bit too far. We shall see. It's a good debate for another day. Let's talk rugby quickly, Ian. Your take on this. We've got a couple of headlines. The Guardian, England set to name both Smiths, Finn and Marcus, starting 15 for France clash, and Finn Smith in at number 10 for France clash in the Times. Marcus Smith will play fullback at Twickenham. And what do you think? Is this a bold attacking move, Ian? We've only got about a minute left. Or is it a roll of the dice by a coach in a desperate spot in Steve Borthwick?
Well, I'm a fan of the Smiths, but whether I will be by full time at the weekend, I don't know. It is a bold move. I mean, look, England always looks to me like a team that doesn't really have an identity. They certainly don't know how to finish games. They don't know how to finish big games and win big games. I'm really surprised that Borthwick's done this so early in the competition. Though it's an enormous gamble, and if it doesn't pay off, then I imagine that his neck will be on the block pretty sharpish.
Just wonder, Miguel, as well, you look for a start, don't you, in other sports to compete with football. Marcus Smith moving from fly half potentially to fullback because of his skill and flair out wide, it says here in the papers. He could be the kind of person to bring it to the foreground, couldn't he? The way he runs with the ball. It's a little bit different. It's what you need potentially to get on the map. You've got about 15 seconds, Miguel. Well,
exactly. They need something different. I mean, I didn't think Ireland were particularly good on Saturday, but still the way they just kind of wore England down, and certainly some sort of spark is required because it was missing.
Yeah, England ran out of puff in the end, didn't I? Luckily, Miguel, Ian, you haven't run out of puff, but we have to cut you off in your prime because the show is finished. Thank you very much for being on Back Pages tonight. We shall see you again soon. Well, if you want to watch the show again, it's available as a podcast. Just download Back Pages tonight or wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Spotify. The show's also back at hour. It's back as well on Wednesday evening. Our guests are Charlotte Dunker and David Ornstein for that. Up next, we've been discussing Mikel Arteta's disappointment in the January transfer window, and we'll hear from the Arsenal manager next.